Well, good morning, everyone, and happy Friday. My name is Brian Carrick, and I'm the Technology Director for the Northwest Akuho Board of Directors. Thrilled to welcome you, and thank you for joining us for our June Friday webinar this morning. Participants, if you look on the bottom right of your screen, you will see a small chat box symbol. If you click that, you'll be able to engage with our presenter this morning and submit any questions that might come up. We'll make sure to leave time at the end for questions, so please submit your questions as you have them via that chat box. This morning, I'm pleased to introduce Janie Sacco, Residence Director at St. Martin's University, who is presenting our June Friday webinar. The presentation is centered on creating a meaningful experience for students with disabilities in residence life, and we're grateful to have her join us this morning. Good morning, Janie.
Good morning, everyone. Hello. Thank you all so much for being here today. We'll go ahead and get started. So I'm very excited to present this webinar on creating a meaningful experience for students with disabilities in residence life. And before I get started, I thought it would be helpful to explain a little bit about why this work is so meaningful. So my passion sparked for working with students with disabilities in a training just like this one. It's kind of one of those things when you see a problem or you see a concern or a population that could use more accommodations in higher education, you just want to help. And once you see one problem or barrier, you kind of start to see them all. So it spiraled into this kind of passion. So over the next 45 minutes, I'm going to go through and talk a little bit about working with students with disabilities, how we all as higher education professionals can make it a more inclusive environment for everyone. And then at the end, you'll have the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have in the comment box. All right, so we'll go ahead and get started. So for the purposes of this presentation, I wanted to go over some of the things I hope that you all will get out of it. So today I'm going to talk about the 3 stages of disability identity development theory. This is a very new theory that's still being researched regarding disability identity. We're going to talk about the principles of universal design and how they can be helpful in working with our students with disabilities. Hopefully you'll walk away with 3 to 5 ways that you and your department can become more supportive of students with disabilities, regardless of what level you are at in terms of inclusion. And then finally, we'll understand how current practices that you might have can be adapted to engage students at all levels of their own disability identity development. All right, so to give us some foundation, it's really important to understand the populations of students that we're working with. So across the world, about 15% of people have disabilities. Now in the United States, that number is actually 20% of United States citizens have disabilities. Breaking that down further, 11% of college students have a disability, and then 88% of disabilities are invisible. And what I mean by that is that it's not apparent that the individual has a disability. And so an invisible identity could be something like a learning disability that you might not see right away or that a student might not choose to disclose. Now, when talking about disability, what we also want to make sure that we're aware of is that the terms accessibility and accommodation are 2 very different terms, yet they can be used interchangeably. When you talk about accessibility, you're referring to a space or an area, and you're discussing access. So you're saying that a program is accessible, meaning it can be accessed by many individuals. Now, when you're talking about an accommodation, that's something that adjusts or adapts the environment. So like an accommodation might be a student who you turn on subtitles for in a movie so that they can understand and hear it a bit better or see what is being said by the actors on screen. If it was an accessible event, the subtitles would already be turned on, or you might not be showing the movie but engaging in another way. So it's really important to know those 2 distinctions when you're talking about working with students with disabilities and the population. So what I'm proposing through this presentation is that we move away from accommodating students more so and creating initially accessible spaces. So that way we're able to do fewer accommodations. And the reason that this is so important is when a student walks into an event or an office and sees that's accessible right away, they feel that acceptance and they feel that they're included in the space. So that's a very important distinction to make. Now, when we're talking about disability identity, it's also very important that we understand that the identity of disability is a spectrum. So it's one of the identities that's very fluid, and students can be at different points of disability identity. For example, up here I have temporarily able-bodied. When we refer to disability identity theory, we do not ever use the term able-bodied because disability is something that can occur in a person at any time and any place in their lifetime. So we all, as temporarily able-bodied individuals, are just that. We're temporarily able-bodied, but at any time our disability status could change. referring to temporarily disabled people, we are talking about folks who may have something that's temporarily impeding their ability to access things and perform different major life events. For example, I remember a very vivid time in 6th grade when I broke my ankle and had to be in a cast. And I realized very quickly that stairs are very inconvenient. And that is something that I experienced only for 6 weeks. After a while, I was on the mend and I was able to not use crutches and I was able to walk upstairs just fine. So that is what we refer to as a temporary disability, because for a moment in time, I was experiencing that barrier, that lack of access. But after a while, I was able to return to my temporarily able-bodied state. Going further down the spectrum, you look at the term of being disabled or having a disability. So this means that you have one disability that impacts major life events. So this can be someone who identifies as deaf, someone who is blind, someone who uses a wheelchair, someone with a learning disability. So just has one of those disabilities. Psychological disabilities such as being bipolar, having depression or anxiety, those can all fall under that category. When we're talking about severely disabled, this is something that is present in disability research, and those are folks who may have two or more disabilities that impact major life events. So this might be someone who, for example, has depression and anxiety, may also have a physical disability. So there are multiple things that they are trying to accommodate in order to kind of fit in the society that we have structured. So I talk about this to give us a little bit of a basis and a background on what disability identity is, and understand that it really does operate on a spectrum. And because of that fluidity, it allows us the opportunity to really think about how we create accessible environments for folks. So now I'm going to move in and talk a little bit about disability identity development theory and kind of where it started and how we've kind of grown in the field. So the first two models I want to talk about are the medical model and the social model. So these two models come from very different places, but the last two theories are rooted in them. So with the medical model of disability, it very much focuses on the idea that people with disabilities should accommodate or fit themselves into the current environment. So they should take advantage of different medical opportunities to make them make it so that they are accommodating and functioning in a way that society has developed as the standard. The social model of disability proposes that the environment itself should change instead to accommodate the individual, meaning that the environment should become as accessible as possible so that everyone can participate rather than the individual themselves changing. Now, from these two different ways of looking at disability, we came with the minority group model, which determined that disability identity itself was its own minority group, and in that way functioned as an identity for individuals. Those three models then bring us to Gibson's identity development theory, which I'm going to talk about in the next slide. So when we look at Gibson's theory, there's three very distinct phases that students can pass through. And what's interesting in higher education is that this model is very fluid, so students can pass through all the stages at any time, and it's really important to know that we need to be able to engage with them at these different levels. So when we're talking about passive awareness, we're talking about a student who might not view their disability as an identity, but rather as something that they're coping with. They even view it as an illness. So this might be a student who's received a new diagnosis or their medical needs aren't being currently met. So I know that from my personal experience, I've worked with students with anxiety or depression before, or who identify on the autism spectrum, who haven't been properly identified, and therefore they're getting medication that doesn't quite work for them, or their accommodations aren't quite aligned, so they're still needing to get assistance. So in this stage, the student might not see their disability as identity, or they might not be having their basic needs met. And it's very much relies on the medical model perspective of where the student's feeling like they need to try and fit in with society as it stands, as opposed to seeking out accommodations necessarily. When we move on, and when that student kind of gets to know their identity a bit more, they might come to the realization stage. Now, in this stage, the student will begin to see disability as an identity that they have. They'll begin to own it and identify in that way. They may start to see inequities in how they are treated versus their temporarily able-bodied peers, and then they might begin to express that as frustration, being upset with the treatment. They might lash out a bit. They might bring more concerns to your attention. And they also might be more concerned on how others perceive them. So if you have a student who might be in a wheelchair, have a physically visible disability, they might be concerned that people view them in a negative light, or might not value their intelligence because they perceive this disability and how that interacts with them. And that's very common working with students in higher education, where they feel like students might feel that they're less than because that they have a disability. Now, if you're able to talk with a student and they're able to work through that, they will get to an acceptance phase. And what that means is that they not only view their disability as an identity, but it's a critical part of them, and they don't view it as a weakness or something that's negative. They may take an active role in working towards equality, working on advocacy. They might start or become a part of a disability student or association. They will begin to view themselves as relevant and not see their disability as something that makes them less than, but just an integral part of who they are. And then the shift in focus comes from being different into a negative light in terms of embracing self. So instead of seeing their disability as a difference that's negative, again, it's more that positive. So I think that our goal as higher education professionals is always be working to get students to that acceptance phase where they're starting to take action and ownership of their disability, and they're working to not only on themselves, but working to educate others. Now, most of us don't work with students who aren't necessarily at the acceptance level yet, though it's the hope that by the time they're done with their college experience, that is the case. We instead might get students who are at the passive awareness level who are seeking us out for different housing accommodations or things that they may need, or problems with their roommate or concerns, and we might see students at the realization stage who are bringing up to us different problems or concerns that we have. Now, in order to work with students at the best level, it's really important that we in higher education think about how we can be accessible and create opportunities for them. I know that in my work at Loyola University, we did a Disability Awareness Week, and so we had a lot of different programs that allowed students to advocate for themselves as well as educate everyone. And so it was really great to see. We had this disability access fair that was set up in one of the buildings. It was really great to see students come through and see the different things they could access. We had students who were temporarily able-bodied who were wanting to learn more and saw how they could be helpful. And then we had students who were identified as having disability who were really appreciative that we were putting on this event. I have this really great, vivid memory of one student who I was flyering and I was asking people to stop by, and the student was like, I can't step by right now, but I really appreciate that you're putting this on because I have epilepsy. And she was shouting this across the room, and I thought, what better celebration of disability identity than a person disclosing that to a bunch of strangers who she doesn't know. And I think at that point we realized, what we're doing is meaningful work, and having that presence and showing that you're being supportive of people with disabilities in itself is a monumental step. So I think that is really important. So now that we've talked a lot about theory and identity and what disability is, we're going to talk about practical ways that we as higher education professionals can go through and can really help students with disabilities. So one of the aspects that I really like is universal design. And universal design, as stated in the PowerPoint, is a process of creating products and events that are usable by the people with the widest range of abilities. What's really great about universal design is that it was born out of disability identity. It can really be applied in any situation, and it makes spaces, programming, and everything we do in residence life really accessible to students. So I think this is a great model to start out with, especially if your university is trying to start to understand how we reach out and work with students with disabilities more. So up here I have displayed the principles of universal design, and what I'm going to do is go through and talk about each of them a little bit and how we can use those to work with students. So when we talk about equability and use, we're really talking about having events in accessible spaces, in spaces in which everyone has the opportunity to access what's going on. And this is something that we can really do in our work in residence halls very easily. So take the time to picture what spaces you have on campus and how they're accessible to students. For example, in our department, we do a lot of programming out of one of our halls on campus, which is on the first floor. It's very accessible. The furniture is all movable, so we can create different spaces as we need them. We have a very large television, so it's very visible to everyone. And the space is really fantastic because it allows for multiple entry points, and it really is an accessible space for all. And we actually have 2 halls are set up like that. So when we have RAs who do programming, we make sure to really talk about the accessible spaces we have on campus and how and where they should set up and place things, and how if they have events in certain places, some people might not be able to access that. So equability and use is a really good guiding principle in terms of our programming. At the same time, flexibility in use is something that we also focus on. So when I think of flexibility in use, I like to think of choices. How are the different ways that students can engage with what you're doing? Flexibility in use can be applied to everything. An area I see it a lot in is marketing. So is your website accessible? Are students who might use screen readers able to use your website easily? How are you advertising your events? Here in our department, we do a lot of advertising that's on social media, but we also make sure we follow that up with emails. We follow that up with flyers and different ways to approach students, and also the one-on-one conversations. Social media is really great for getting the message out, but you want to make sure you're doing it in an accessible way, because social media at times can be very difficult to use, especially if a student has screen readers, has low vision. You really want to make sure that you're using it to engage in different things. The other thing is when we use our print advertisement, we make sure that we're using a font that is accessible. For those of you who aren't aware, sans serif font, so a font without serifs, and that's something that is not Times New Roman. So the font I'm using here, for example, is a font that we will all use in all of our university publication, at least through our department, because serif font is harder for students with dyslexia or dysgraphia to read. And we want to make sure that, again, our materials are flexible and able to be used by the most people possible. When we talk about something that's simple, intuitive, and use, we're making sure that it's not overly complicated. So we use a lot of flow charts for our processes. We make it very clear. These are the 3 things that you need to do to engage in this program or this initiative, and this is how you do it. So when you're designing the processes in your office, think about how they're currently structured. Are they very simple and easy to use? Is it something that a student could do without guidance, or would you need to have someone there to explain what's going on? How might they engage with that process? So that one is a really great one to hold on to, and I find it makes it really simple for students in general to engage with. So a little side note, the thing about universal design is while it directly benefits our students with disabilities, it also benefits everyone in terms of making processes really easy and streamlined. And I already talked about this a bit with flexibility in use, but when we're talking about perceptible information, we want to make sure that, again, the information you're putting out there, whether it's for marketing purposes or whether it's in a program, that you're doing it in a variety of ways. So, for example, I tell students when they're putting on a program, sometimes it's great for them to have written directions for students to follow in case they come in late or miss what's going on. Or they have some type of aid instead of just speaking, because students might miss that. So making sure your information is perceivable in a variety of ways. You also want to make sure that there's tolerance for error. So I don't see this as much in the physical space. However, I do see that when I work on my web design for students. So tolerance for error means that if a student makes a mistake, that's pretty easy for them to correct it. So, for example, if they're filling out their housing application, are they able to go back and correct typos and errors that they may have made previously? Is that an easy process for them to do? That's just one example, but tolerance for error is really important, especially for students who may have disabilities that are learning, cognitive, or psychological. That's really helpful for them to be able to go back and make those corrections. Another thing we want to consider is the type of programs we're offering or things that we're doing in residence life, having a low physical effort. So students sometimes get a little trepidatious when I mention this one, and I like to tell them this doesn't mean that you can't have your rock climbing program, but you want to think about how is that accessible for everyone. And the great thing is once you start asking about these things and diving deeper, you find that you can really accommodate them. For example, I had a colleague of mine took students on a service trip to the Grand Canyon, and one of her students happened to be blind, and they were able to easily accommodate that. That student was able to fully participate in service, but all they had to do was ask how they might do that. So really thinking about if you have programs with a high physical effort that might be having people shy away from them, how might that student still participate, and are there options for them? And I think more often than not, you'll find that they are. And the last is size and space for approachability and use. So it's really important to consider that your space is appropriate for the students that you serve. One of the most notable examples I have is that I did an internship in a disability office, and they had built this whole new space that was supposed to be accessible and universally designed, which was great. So you go into the office, everything looks good. It looks very approachable. However, when you go to a disability support advocate store, the doors were not wide enough for wheelchairs when they built them. And they had forgotten to include that in the core concept of the design. So a space that was supposed to be very approachable for everyone was not. And we had to do some creative meetings temporarily until we were able to fix that problem. So you really want to think about how your office is set up. Is it accessible for people in general, or is it accessible for students with disabilities? So hopefully those examples I talked through gave you some ideas about how you can apply universal design to the work that we are currently doing. And if you have any questions, I encourage you to put them in the comment box so I can answer them at the end of the presentation. So the other part of higher education is much in residence life as we are creating processes and we're creating programs that are accessible for students. We're also having conversations with them and trying to develop our students and helping them go through these different phases. So I encourage you all to really think about if you have a student who's showing signs of being maybe in the passive awareness phase, not really owning their disability, like how might you be able to reach out to them, and how might you help them to encourage to explore their identity? Obviously, we really want to make sure that they're set up with our disability services and support offices, but how might you have them work with their RA to make sure they're feeling included in the floor? How might you make sure that they feel like they can talk to and disclose and feel comfortable about what's going on? Having a student in the realization phase, how do you support them when they might run into a barrier that they can't change? Like they might be extremely frustrated that there are no elevators on campus and there are stairs everywhere and that they can't get around or physically meet the space. Or they might be very frustrated that there are not a lot of accommodations for low vision folks. There's not enough Braille around campus. There's very limited computers they can use. And how do you really work with that, engage them in that critical conversation and use that frustration and gear them towards creating positive change? And then when students are in the acceptance phase, how do you encourage that? Encourage them to be critical thinkers and to really kind of work to help develop that disability identity support system. So when we see students at these different phases, understand that the different things we're doing in the offices may or may not accommodate them. I can make my office as inclusive and universally designed as possible, but if I'm not willing to have those conversations with students about the current struggles that they're having and the different barriers that are present, then I'm not really engaging them where they need to be at. So I bring this up to really make sure we're tying the Gibson's disability identity development theory into universal design, making sure that we are aware of students at different levels and how we as universities can support students where they're at and make sure that they have a really good experience. And that brings us to best practices. So while I've talked a lot about theory and different things we can do, I want to make sure that I took some time to talk about some different best practices that we all can do as higher education professionals. So as I alluded to in my previous slide, we really want to make sure we're embracing critical dialogue with students. And there's no excuses for not doing that. So think about, is your university or your department able to have discussion about disability identity? Is this something that you all normally talk about? Is it part of your meetings when you're coming up with initiatives and programs? Are you thinking about students with disabilities? If you're not currently, I encourage you to do so. Even if there's not a lot of resources or things that you can do, make students with disabilities part of your regular dialogue when you're coming up with events. I know that whenever we're brainstorming, I always think about and bring up like, well, if we have a student who's hard of hearing, which we do have students who are, how are they going to engage in this program? How are we serving them? Just bringing up the dialogue, I think, is really helpful because it gets your department in the mindset of accessibility. You also want to make sure you're incorporating the voice of students with disabilities into your work. So if you're designing a new accessible website, you want to make sure you're reaching out to students who you may know who have disclosed that they have a disability and ask them what they think about it. It's really important that we put the voices of students into our work, and I think it can sometimes be hard to reach out to students with disabilities because there might be a taboo around it or whatnot. But really, the more you can incorporate those students into what you do, the more comprehensive your work is going to be. You also want to make sure that you use inclusive language. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a slide or two. Including inclusive language in your work is really apparent. When a student goes onto your website and visits it and they see language that might be outdated or might be viewed as even derogatory, they are going to know that or going to get the feeling that your office is not inclusive of people with disabilities, and that may be a turnoff for them, so they might not seek you as a resource. So I can't emphasize enough how important it is to be aware of what inclusive language is and how you can make sure that that is something that's regularly being utilized in your department. And so what I would recommend is think about how the last thing is think about the universal design practices that I outlined and how you can put those into your work. So what are 3 things you can do from there? When I do this presentation for a larger group, that's something we all brainstorm together. But I encourage you all to think about when we think about flexibility in use or when we think about having a low physical effort or different principles, like how can you take those principles and apply those to different things you're currently doing? One thing that I always think about is for our resident assistants, we make it or at least I do with my staff, we make it mandatory that when they're showing a movie that they put on subtitles in English. And that's great because it allows students to not have to disclose they might not have a disability if they're not comfortable with that. But it's also great not only for our students with disabilities, but our international student population as well, who might be able to more easily process the information as it's viewed on a screen as opposed to hearing the actors talk about it. So thinking about those best practices that we can utilize. So a side note on inclusive language. So when we're talking about inclusive language, especially with disability, a lot of these things are newer, and disability identity is really becoming, in the last, I'd say, decade or so, something that we're talking about more. When we're talking about students with disabilities, we really want to make sure we're saying students with disabilities because that's person-first language. When you say disabled person or disabled students, you're making the disability the thing that comes first. However, disability is an identity and not their whole entity as a human being. So we want to make sure we're really putting that emphasis on as people first language. And I found that to be really helpful, especially in communities with college students, so they feel like instead of being talked about as a disabled person, they're being talked about as a person with one of their identities happening to be that of a disability. The other thing we want to be sure is, and I mentioned this earlier, is being able to distinguish between disability, accessible, and ADA. Those three words you want to use instead of a couple different things. So handicapped is something I see a lot still in parking lots, in websites, and a variety of things. And handicapped is still thought of as a very acceptable term. However, anyone with a disability will tell you that's a derogatory term in their community. Handicapped is very outdated. It's older. It's something that people will cringe at. At least I've seen that in my work with students. So when you talk about like handicap parking, instead consider the terms accessible parking or ADA parking or ADA accommodations. So looking through your websites or looking through different things and seeing, are any of these words in here? Crippled and retarded are ones that are more well-known as ones that are derogatory, but I thought they'd be worth mentioning there as well. The other interesting nomenclature for inclusive language is the deaf community. So here I have the big D with a little d, and what that means is the deaf community very much identifies as a culture. So being deaf for those folks is very much a part of who they are, and they see it as a cultural identity. Therefore, many folks who identify as being deaf will capitalize that. So they might identify as hard of hearing if they are not completely deaf. But the one thing they will never do is say that they are hearing impaired. Hearing impaired is a very derogatory term, and if you refer to that to anyone in that community, you will quickly learn that, as I had the unfortunateness of doing one time myself when I slipped up on that. So just be aware that hearing impaired is not something that you would want to refer to. It either be deaf or hard of hearing. And again, these languages are changing every time. So this brings me to the end of my part of the presentation. I really want to open up to any questions that you all might have. So as we're going into the question section reflecting, I want us to think about how your department addresses students of different stages of their identity development currently, how they do that, as well as thinking about changes or new initiatives that you can implement, any questions you might have for me regarding those. So at this time, I'm happy to answer any questions, so feel free to type them in.
For any participants that missed the instruction on the front end, there is a chat box on the bottom right of your screen. If you click the chat box icon, that will populate the group chat. Please submit your questions there. We'll take a minute here to collect them, and then Janie, I'll start delivering those.
Great.
And Janie, while we're waiting for the questions to roll in, we do have a request to go back to the slide of reflection questions.
Oh, absolutely.
So Janie, our first question, in your research or personal experience, what are some of the most common mistakes that housing professionals are making when they're working with students with disabilities?
That's a really good question. I think that the most common thing I see is websites, using a language that's a bit out of date, and and also using a website that's not in an accessible format. So when you're working with your webmaster or whoever is operating on websites, making sure that you're checking with them to make sure your website meets the basic criteria, and they will have those outlined for you. I think that that's probably one of the biggest, I wouldn't say mistakes, but biggest misconceptions or things that folks aren't aware of. When I see students working with people with disabilities, what I see most is people unaware of different things that they can do. So that unawareness allows for some mistakes, and that relates back to inclusive language not being as present, or even creating programs that may not be accessible. So I'd say that's the second big thing I notice is folks creating programs that could easily be accessible, but because of a lack of awareness, they're not. So again, simple things like including subtitles, making sure that you're providing food or things like that that can be consumed by the most people possible, making sure that your spaces are accessible. Those are things that you can implement or require in basic programming that would allow for a more accessible environment. So I'd say that website maintenance and making sure you're staying up to date on language as well as creating spaces are the two biggest things that people might miss.
Thank you. There's some discussion in our group chat, too, around needs assessment. Are you aware of any institutions that are using quarterly surveys or otherwise, or are you personally at your institution conducting any kinds of needs assessment for students?
My institution is not conducting needs assessment. However, at the last institution I worked with, we did send out a survey to our students who have registered within the Disability Services Office. And in that survey, we asked them to disclose a little bit about their experience at the university, as well as how they were accessing resources within the office. And with that, they were able to pull a lot of really good data about how they could make the office a little bit more accessible. And so there was not it was a homegrown tool, so it wasn't anything that was a standardized tool or set that could be utilized, but it was basically asking students to disclose their identity, talking about very concrete services that the office offered, and then going back and asking them like how they might improve that or how they felt. So it was very much satisfaction based. But from that, they were able to get some really great results from students. They made some changes. So for example, one of the changes that came out of that was we realized how we were setting up our finals testing was very cumbersome for students. The classrooms that we had them in were not quiet enough. There were too many people in them. So from that, we were able to get more volunteers to help facilitate or proctor exams, and that allows us to use more classrooms to allow a quieter testing environment. So I'm not aware of a standard tool, but as long as you're creating a tool that's very much satisfaction-based and you're creating measures based on a few things you can practically change, I think that's a really useful way to go.
Great. Well, Janie, I think you got the membership's questions answered. So on behalf of Northwest Akuo and the Professional Development Committee, thank you for sharing your knowledge with the membership this morning.
Thank you very much for having me. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to send me an email, catch me on Twitter. I'm happy to answer any of them.
That's great. And to our participants, thank you for joining us today. With the upcoming holiday, our next Friday webinar will be on July 10th. So mark your calendars, and we hope you'll join us then. Have a great weekend, everyone.